Hello, I'm Benjamin Tallis of the Centre for European Security of the Institute of International Relations in Prague. In the wake of the tragic Manchester attacks, it's important to discuss what are the most effective responses against terrorism. We can see that in the wake of the attacks, politicians and citizens alike have pledged their commitment not to let the attacks disrupt Britain's liberal ways of life or to negatively affect the diverse community cohesion that cities like Manchester have achieved. But conversely, we see the British press, particularly the right-wing parts of it, welcoming the arrival of Fortress Britain with troops on the street and widespread calls for increased police powers, increased powers of surveillance, increased police funding, and other measures that might actually negatively affect the liberal Britain that others have promised to protect. So let's go through some of the measures that have been proposed and see what their effects might be. Calling for increased access control, security checks, and improved detection equipment has become something of a default response to any terrorist attack because it's ostensibly the least contentious. Financial and political economic costs aside, we can see, however, that this can only ever be a partial solution. The sheer variety of spaces that terrorists can attack, from the nondescript public space where the Dortmund football team was attacked, to the packed marketplace in Berlin or the pubs and cafes of Paris, it would not only be impossible but also undesirable to secure all these spaces and implement access control measures at them. The city should not be made into a big airport, and it would be impossible to do so. So we have to remember that while these measures might be quite useful, they would only be partial, and they can also have a negative effect, changing the character of our cities and the ways people feel free to move through them. Similarly, police checks on people moving through the city might be to a certain extent useful in preventing potential attackers from moving through certain spaces or carrying particular weapons. But it can also raise issues about people's sense of belonging. Stop and search in London, famously as one example of repeated police checks that actually negatively impact on certain communities feeling that they actually belong in the city. This can actually create oppression, alienation, that can turn into potential support for terrorism, but also crucially denies the police and security services access to intelligence and information which can prevent terrorist attacks. So actually, from the point of view of effectiveness as well as the point of view of human rights and civil liberties, any such measures like this would have to be carefully managed. The same applies to increased powers of surveillance and interrogation or detention without charge, and the kind of civil liberties restrictions that were introduced under control orders previously in the UK, and then slightly ameliorated with the introduction of so-called TPIMs. All of these type of measures can also have the negative effect of undermining the low-profile, long-term and laborious work of community policing, of putting the police at the heart of the community, making them a service rather than a force, and a trusted partner for all members of the community. This has proved extremely effective in tense and divided communities with the potential for violence from Northern Ireland to the Balkans, as well as in various parts of the UK. And we should be very careful not to undermine community policing by knee-jerk or heavy-handed reactions to this terrorist attack or any other. The presence of troops on the streets with camouflage uniforms and long-barreled weapons is anathema to community policing, and so the military assistance to civil power provided under Operation Tempora should be made as low profile as possible and should be managed extremely carefully under police command to avoid giving the impression that the British state is militarizing its relations with minority communities, particularly the Muslim community. What we can see is that the increased presence of police, as well as of armed police, as well as troops on the street, also increases the potential for fatal incidents, such as when tragically Jean-Charles de Menezes was shot dead in the tense atmosphere in London in the wake of the 7/7 attacks more than a decade ago. And these type of fatal incidents could potentially precipitate further retaliatory attacks, while the clampdowns on civil liberties and potential alienation of certain communities could increase the preconditions for attacks, thereby fulfilling the two conditions that terrorism expert Martha Crenshaw has identified as the key causes of terrorism. So while they may have potential short-term preventive effects, they might also have the opposite effect in the longer run. What we have to be very careful of as well is that we don't follow the French and Belgian examples or Belgian examples of heavy-handed policing of Muslim communities in particular. We've seen that the presence of troops on the streets did not prevent attacks in Brussels nor in Nice, even though there was a state of emergency in France at the time. And the heavy-handed policing of the Muslim community has actually potentially caused damage to community police relations that will take years to repair, and makes both France and Belgium less rather than more safe in the medium term. It's hard to say at the moment whether Britain is going more in the direction of liberal Britain or fortress Britain, and it is encouraging that the government has so far rejected calls for increased powers for the police, but we can't be sure this will last. Increased surveillance may be sanctioned without necessary democratic oversight or accountability. We may see more cosmetic yet oppressive security measures preferred to community policing. We should indeed resist this because it deprives police of the intelligence they need. To read the rest of my recommendations to the British government on this matter and the rest of my analysis, you can find a new European security spotlight on the Institute of International Relations website. Thank you.